the first thing that hit the pavement was a tin bucket of roses. It didn't tip. It was launched, sent sideways by the arm of a man who had never once been made to feel that what he destroyed had value. The bucket struck the asphalt and the roses went everywhere. Pink and white and deep red, scattered across the warm evening street like something thrown away. Then the cart itself followed. One hard shove and the whole structure lurched, wooden shelves cracking against the ground, glass water vials shattering, lavender bundles splitting open and releasing their scent into the heavy air like a last breath. Draven Korradi's men didn't move. They didn't need to. He had already done what he came to do. And through all of it, the crash, the breaking, the slow roll of a single rose across the pavement, Elira Marvayne said nothing. She didn't step back. She didn't raise her hands. She knelt beside what remained of her cart with both arms wrapped around a small girl who had wandered too close and gotten caught in the wreckage. The child was trembling. Elira was not. She held her the way someone holds a frightened thing, completely still, completely certain, her chin lowered over the girl's dark hair, her eyes tracking Draven without blinking. He noticed the woman's stillness the way you notice something wrong in a room you can't immediately name. Then he looked at the child's face. Something moved through him, fast, wordless, gone before he could place it. He turned away from it. He walked back to the car. The door closed. The city kept moving. He didn't look back. He should have looked back. Draven Korradi was 39 years old and had spent the better part of 2 decades making sure his name meant something in every room it entered before he did. He didn't run the city. He didn't need to. He simply controlled enough of it that the distinction stopped mattering. The port logistics. The construction contracts. The elected officials who returned his calls on the first ring and asked no questions about why. Entire blocks had been quietly reorganized around his interests, old markets relocated, family businesses absorbed, neighborhoods that had held their shape for generations reshaped in a single quarter. Nobody called it what it was. They called it development. They called it progress. People who worked for him called him precise. People who had negotiated against him called him immovable. People who had crossed him didn't call him anything at all. Nobody called him a good man. And Draven had long since stopped noticing the absence of that. There was only one thing in his life that existed outside the architecture of power and control, one person who had never once been afraid of him, who climbed into his lap uninvited and fell asleep there, who called him Papa in a voice that made every room feel smaller and warmer than it actually was. Talera was 6 years old. She had her mother's eyes and his silence and absolutely none of his edges. She was the only thing he had ever protected without strategy. She collected stray things, bottle caps, smooth pebbles, a plastic butterfly she found on the pavement once and carried home like a found treasure. She asked questions that had no tactical value whatsoever. Why is the sky different colors at night? Do fish know they're in water? She expected answers, and she waited for them with the patience of someone who had never been told her questions were inconvenient. Draven answered every one of them. He kept her in the East residence, gated, staffed, secured by 3 rotating guards he had personally vetted over 18 months. He reviewed the security rotation every Monday. He had contingency plans for contingency plans. He had never once let her feel the weight of any of it because protecting her was the only thing he had ever done that was purely, uncalculatingly his. He had no idea that 3 weeks ago, on a rain-soaked street corner he never visited, a woman with a flower cart had already done it for him, without a gate, without a guard, and without asking for a single thing in return. The corner of Verano and 9th had belonged to Elira Marvayne for 4 years. She had chosen it the way people choose the things that matter most, not strategically, but because it felt right. The light fell across it differently in the early morning, long and warm and full of dust motes that made the flowers look like they were breathing. The foot traffic was steady without being frantic. The residents of the surrounding blocks had learned her schedule and adjusted their own around it. Mrs. Okafor from the apartment above the pharmacy always stopped on Tuesdays for white carnations. The old man who walked his dog at 6:15 always paused to smell the lavender and never bought anything, and Elira never minded because his face when he leaned in was worth more than a sale. She sold flowers the way her mother had taught her, generously. If someone came to the cart with grief in their eyes and not enough money for what they needed, she gave them what they needed and let the accounting sort itself out later. She charged what she could and charged less than that to the people she could tell couldn't afford it. She had never once turned a significant profit. She also had never once considered stopping. When Draven's men came, there were 2 of them. They wore the particular kind of expensive casual clothing that announces itself without trying. One of them set a folded document on the corner of her cart without looking. Hello lovelies, welcome to Corvain Chronicles. What would you do if someone wants to take what belongs to you because they are more powerful than you are? Let us know what you would do on the comment, subscribe and share so others can partake in this uplifting story. She read it carefully, both sides, taking her time. Then she folded it in half and held it back out to him. The corner is not available, she said. He looked at her then, really looked, the way people look when they've encountered something that hasn't processed correctly. She looked back without performance. She was not defiant. She was simply clear, the way a wall is clear, the way a closed door is clear. It was not a negotiating position. It was just the truth. He took the document back. He didn't say anything else. He left. Elira watched them go, then turned back to her roses and continued trimming the stems at an angle the way her mother had shown her, cutting them underwater so the cells didn't seal. She did not think of herself as brave. She thought of herself as someone who had already decided what she would and wouldn't accept from the world, and had simply not yet been offered anything worth revising that decision. The rain had started just after dark and become serious by 8 o'clock. Elira had been packing up late, a delivery had come in damaged and she'd spent an hour resorting the inventory by hand, pulling out the stems that wouldn't survive and setting aside the ones that still might. She was almost finished when she heard it, not a sound exactly, more like a quality of silence coming from the wrong direction. She looked up. At the edge of the intersection, where Verano met the main boulevard, a small figure stood on the curb. A girl, no older than 5 or 6, in a pale pink dress that was darkening with rain. She was not crying. She was standing very still in the particular way that children stand when they have gone past being scared and arrived somewhere further and quieter than fear. The traffic light changed. Cars moved. The girl did not. Elira left the cart. She didn't think about it. She crossed the distance in the time it takes to decide and gathered the child back from the curb with both hands, pulling her in by the collar of her coat the way you'd pull something back from a ledge, and then she knelt down in the rain and put her hands on either side of the girl's face and looked at her. The girl looked back. Her eyes were dark and enormous and utterly unreadable. "What is your name?" Elira asked. A pause. Then, very quietly, "Talara." Elira smiled at her. "That's a serious name," she said. "It suits you." Something in Talara's face shifted almost imperceptibly, as if the word serious had landed somewhere it was needed. Elira brought her back to the cart and sat down on the wet curb with her, wrapping her own jacket around the girl's small shoulders. She bought 2 hot chocolates from the corner stall across the street, handing one to Talara and wrapping the girl's hands around the cup and watching her grip tighten with the warmth. They sat together while the rain kept falling and the traffic moved and the city went on being the city, indifferent to all of it. She asked no questions about where Talara had come from or who she belonged to. She talked to her the way you talk to someone who needs to be reminded that the world is manageable, slowly, about small things, about the names of flowers and what they smell like in different weather and which ones come back every year without being asked to. Talara listened with her whole body, leaning in slightly, the hot chocolate steaming against her chin. The men arrived almost 2 hours later. 3 of them, moving fast, their faces tight with an anxiety that looked trained over but hadn't quite covered. One of them said the girl's name and Talara turned toward the sound with the specific recognition of someone who knows that voice well. Elira stood and stepped aside and let them have her. One of the men turned back. "Your name?" he said. "We'll need to tell her father." "No need," Elira said. "She's fine. That's all that matters." She watched them bundle Talara into the black car and shut the door, the engine already running. She watched the car until it turned the corner and disappeared. Then she pulled her jacket back around herself, finished packing the remaining stems into their overnight buckets, and walked home in the rain. She did not think of it as anything remarkable. A child had been frightened. She had stayed with her. That was simply what you did. He came himself. That was the first thing Elira noticed, not that the car had stopped, not that the door had opened, but that the man who stepped out was alone in the way that powerful men are never alone. Surrounded by bodies but isolated by consequence. She had heard his name. Everyone on Verano had heard his name. She had never let it mean anything particular to her, the way she had decided not to let certain kinds of weather mean anything particular. You acknowledged it. You didn't let it rearrange your plans. He walked toward her with the specific economy of movement that comes from a body accustomed to arriving places and having things change when it does. He stopped at a distance that was still too close. He looked at her cart, then at her, with the evaluating stillness of a man measuring something he intends to remove. I'll ask once, he said. His voice was low and even and entirely without inflection, the way a fact is delivered rather than a threat. Leave the corner. Today. Whatever you need to relocate, I'll cover. Elira looked at him the way she'd looked at his men, not with hostility, not with the performed fearlessness of someone pretending not to feel what they feel, but with the quiet steadiness of someone who has genuinely, in advance, made peace with whatever comes next. This corner is my livelihood, she said. I've been here 4 years. I haven't done anything to earn this. You don't need to have done anything, he said. You're in the way. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, I'm sorry. I can't help you. His jaw tightened. It was a small movement, almost invisible, but she caught it. She thought, not for the first time, that men like this gave themselves away in the smallest contractions, the almost nothing that happened in their faces when the world failed to organize itself the way they required. He turned to his men. What happened next was swift and without ceremony. One of them grabbed the cart's frame. Another pushed from the side. Draven himself reached across the top and swept the front display with a single motion, vases going over, water hitting the pavement in a cold flat splash, roses scattering everywhere, pink and white and deep red sliding across the warm asphalt in all directions. The cart frame hit the ground a moment later. The crack of it was loud and final. Elira did not scream. She did not step back. She knelt down beside what was broken, and she began, carefully, to gather the stems that could still be saved, setting them aside with the quiet methodical attention of someone who intends to open tomorrow regardless. Draven stood over the wreckage. He was breathing slightly harder than he had been. He looked at the woman kneeling in the spilled water and the broken glass, and something moved through his face, the same fast, wordless thing that had moved through him the evening before when he'd told himself it was nothing, and again he turned away from it. He walked back to the car. He did not look at the small pink shoe lying among the scattered roses. He didn't notice it was there. The door closed. The car moved. His hands, he realized, were not entirely steady. Sorek had worked for Draven for 11 years and had learned, across those years, to read the room before he entered it. He knocked once that evening and waited for 2 full seconds before opening the office door, which was the interval that meant, I have something you need to hear and I have already decided how to say it. He set the tablet on the desk without preamble. Routine surveillance review from the past 30 days, he said. The neighborhood around Verano and 9th. There's a flag from 3 weeks ago. He paused. I think you should see it before I say anything else. He pressed play and stepped back. The footage was high angle, black and white, time-stamped at 2014. The rain was visible as static interference across the lens, the kind of driving rain that turns street lights into blurs. The corner of Verano and the main boulevard. The intersection. Draven watched a small figure step off the pavement at the crosswalk edge. He knew her gait before he consciously recognized her. The way Talira carried herself even at 6 years old, that particular uprightness, slightly too formal for a child her age, as if she was always paying close attention to something. He had noticed it when she was 3 and thought it was something she'd grow out of, and then realized it was simply who she was. He watched her stand at the edge of the traffic. He watched the cars. He watched a woman drop a bucket and run. The screen wasn't large, but it didn't need to be. He watched Elira Marvayne catch Talira by the collar of her coat and pull her back from the road. He watched her kneel down and put both hands on the girl's face. He watched them sit down together on the wet curb, the woman taking off her own jacket and wrapping it around the child. He watched Talira receive the hot chocolate and wrap both hands around the cup. He watched them sit there together in the rain for 1 hour and 43 minutes. The timestamp moved in the corner of the screen. Draven did not move at all. When his men finally arrived and took Talira, the camera caught Elira standing and watching the car until it turned out of frame. Then she went back to her cart. She packed up the remaining flowers. She walked out of the camera's range. Sorek reached over and stopped the footage. The office was very quiet. Draven sat back in his chair. He sat back slowly, the way a person sits back when the thing beneath them has shifted and they are not entirely sure the ground will hold. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally said something, it was not what Sorek was expecting. It was not rage and it was not an instruction and it was not anything that sounded like the man Sorek had worked for across 11 years. He said, "How long has she had that cart on that corner?" Sorek looked at him carefully. "4 years, sir." Draven nodded once. He looked at the blank screen. Then he said, "Leave me." Sorek left him. He drove to the east residence himself, which he almost never did unannounced and never did at that hour. The guard at the gate recognized the car and opened without being asked. Draven walked through the main entrance and up the stairs with the quiet of someone moving through a space that was also moving through them. Talira's room was at the end of the hall. The door was open 2 inches, the way she preferred it. She didn't like the full dark, but she also didn't like too much light from the hall, and whoever put her to bed had learned to split the difference. A narrow strip of warm yellow fell across the floor. He pushed the door open gently and stood in the doorway. She was asleep on her side, one hand folded under her cheek, the other stretched out toward the edge of the mattress as if she'd been reaching for something in a dream. Her breathing was slow and steady and entirely herself. On the shelf beside the bed, between the small lamp and the row of smooth pebbles she'd been collecting since she was 4, there was a folded piece of fabric he had never seen before. Green wool, worn soft at the edges, folded into a careful rectangle. He had never thought to ask about it. He crossed the room and sat in the chair beside her bed. He did not pick up the scarf. He just sat with it nearby and looked at his daughter sleeping and let the full weight of the evening land on him without managing it. He thought about the footage. He thought about the timestamp moving in the corner of the screen. 1 hour and 43 minutes. A woman sitting in the rain with his daughter because his daughter was frightened and needed someone to stay, and she had simply stayed. He thought about the cart going over on Verano and 9th. The roses hitting the pavement. The woman kneeling in the broken glass and water without screaming, without running, just gathering the stems that could still be saved with the focused patience of someone who intends to open tomorrow regardless. He thought about the small pink shoe lying among the scattered flowers. That thought was the one he couldn't move past. Talira had been there. He had gone to that corner to clear an obstacle and his daughter had been standing in the wreckage of the woman who had saved her life, and he hadn't known, and he had walked away, and his hands hadn't been steady on the wheel, and now he understood why. He sat in the chair until the room was completely dark and the house had gone fully quiet. When Sorek appeared in the doorway an hour later, because Sorek always appeared when he was needed, which was one of the 11-year reasons Draven had never replaced him, he didn't turn around. He just said, quietly, so as not to wake her. "She asked about the woman, didn't she?" It was not a question. Sorek was quiet for a moment. Then, "For 2 weeks, sir. Every day. She called her the flower lady. We told her we didn't know who she was." Draven nodded. He looked at the green scarf on the shelf. He looked at his daughter's hand stretched toward the edge of the mattress. He found her the next morning on the corner of Aldana and 5th, a different corner, smaller, less favorable light. She had a new cart, a fraction of the size of the old one, and she was arranging what inventory she'd salvaged from the day before with the calm methodical attention of someone who has decided not to let circumstances make decisions for them. She was not hiding. She was simply continuing. Draven came alone. He had not come alone to a conversation in years. Possibly longer. He understood, walking across the pavement toward her, that this was the point, that he had nothing to bring here except himself, which was exactly the condition he was least equipped to manage. She saw him when he was still 20 feet away. She didn't react, didn't tense, didn't reach for anything, didn't arrange her expression into something prepared. She just watched him come and then stood still when he stopped, with the same quality of patient clarity she'd had on Verano and 9th. As if she'd already decided that whatever this conversation was, she would be honest inside it. He had prepared something on the drive over. An acknowledgement. A direct statement of what he'd seen in the footage and what it meant in terms of what had happened at the cart. He was good at structured conversations. They kept the thing from getting out from under him. He lost the structure almost immediately. I was at the residence last night, he said. He stopped. Started again. 3 weeks ago. A rainy night. My daughter, he stopped again. She waited. I saw the footage, he said. I watched all of it. He paused. I know what you did. Elira looked at him for a moment. She folded her arms loosely across her chest, not defensively, just as something to do with herself. Then she looked away briefly toward the street, and when she looked back her expression was not surprised. It looked, if anything, like someone who had quietly known this conversation would find her eventually and had simply been waiting to see how it arrived. You didn't know, she said. It was a statement, not an absolution. No, he said. I didn't know. He paused. That doesn't fix what I did. No, she agreed. It doesn't. That stopped him. He had expected more. He didn't know what more, an argument, an accusation, something he could respond to and control the direction of. What he had not expected was simple agreement delivered without heat, without leverage, without any interest whatsoever in making him feel worse than he already did. He had never met a conversation without an angle. This one had no angle in it. She wasn't performing forgiveness and she wasn't performing grievance. She was just telling him what was true and waiting to see what he would do with it. I didn't do it for you, she said then. Her voice was level and entirely without unkindness. I didn't know whose child she was. I didn't ask. She was just a little girl in the rain and I was there and she needed someone to stay. That's the only reason. Draven stood with that for a moment. He had been the most feared man in 3 districts for 15 years. He had sat across tables from people who wanted things from him and people who feared him and people who were trying to take from him, and he had read every one of them correctly within the first 4 minutes. He knew the texture of every kind of human transaction. He had no category for this. A woman had saved his daughter's life and asked for nothing and had no angle and was simply standing here with a smaller cart on a worse corner, telling him she would have done the same thing for any frightened child, and meaning it. He found that he could not speak for a moment. She let him stand there in the silence. She didn't fill it for him. She had learned a long time ago that some silences needed to be inhabited rather than resolved, and that the men who rushed to fill them usually hadn't yet arrived at what they needed to say. Draven gathered himself after a moment. She could see it happen, the slight squaring of his shoulders, the careful return to whatever passed for composure in him, and looked at her directly. I want to make this right, he said. The cart. What I destroyed. I'll replace everything, better than it was. I'll cover whatever losses you had from yesterday. He paused. And the corner is yours. I'll have it cleared by the end of the day. Elira looked at him steadily. He kept going, because he was a man who filled silence with solutions. He told her he could relocate the territorial interest that had put her corner in play. He told her the replacement cart could be built to whatever specification she named. He told her he could make what had happened yesterday disappear practically, that the neighborhood would not remember it in the way it would have for anyone else. She waited until he was finished. Then she said, I don't want your money. He stopped. She held up one hand, not harshly. I'm going to say something and I need you to hear it as simply as I mean it, with nothing else in it. He was quiet. What you did yesterday was wrong, she said. Not because I refused you and you punished me for it, though that's also true. Wrong because you came to a place where someone was doing something that hurt nobody and you destroyed it because it was in your way. She paused. I don't need that compensated. Money doesn't fix the logic of it. He held her gaze. His jaw was very still. What I want, she said, is the corner. Just the corner, returned, not as a favor, not with conditions, not as something I owe you for. Just because it was mine before you touched it and it should be mine again. That's all. She waited. Draven Korradi had been told no 3 times in his professional life. Each time it had cost the other person something. He had never been told no and then had no offered alongside it, not a counter, not a lever, not an angle. Just a clean, uncomplicated statement of what was right. He stood there for 3 or 4 seconds that felt considerably longer. Then he said, "It's already done." He held her gaze for one moment more, as if there was something else he meant to say and then decided against it. Then he turned and walked back to the car. Elira watched him go. She didn't thank him. There was nothing to thank him for. She had simply asked for what was already hers, and he had said yes, and that was the beginning and end of what had been owed. She turned back to her cart. She straightened a stem in the nearest arrangement, something to do with her hands, and stood in the thin morning light on the corner of Aldana and 5th, and thought that tomorrow she would be back on Verano and 9th, and thought that the lavender needed water, and thought about her mother, and let the morning be the morning. He made 3 calls that afternoon. The first was to the lieutenant who had managed the Verano acquisition. "The block is off limits," Draven said. "Permanently. Adjust the route accordingly." The lieutenant paused 1 beat longer than was wise and then said yes and asked no further questions, which suggested he had already heard something about the previous day and had been waiting to see what shape the consequence would take. The second call was to a builder he trusted with projects that required precision over speed. He described the specifications: a cart, working surface, deep frame, storage below. Quality materials, nothing ornamental. He described the approximate dimensions of what he'd seen on Verano. "Have it delivered to the corner by Friday," he said. No note. No branding. Nothing that attributes it. The third call he made sitting in his car outside the residence for 6 minutes before he placed it. It was to the head of his legal team. He wanted to know what would be required to establish a formal commercial protection for the Verano and 9th corner, not ownership, not a lease arrangement, nothing that would entangle the vendor. Simply a standing document that made the location untouchable by any entity operating within his network or adjacent to it. Something that existed without requiring her knowledge or consent or gratitude. His lawyer was quiet for a moment. "That's an unusual request," she said. "Set it up," Draven said, and ended the call. He told no one else. He offered no explanations. When 2 of his lieutenants raised the Verano adjustment at the Thursday meeting, carefully, obliquely, in the way that people raise things they're not certain they're allowed to raise, he looked at them with the specific quality of attention that meant, "This is not a conversation we're having." They moved on. The cart appeared on the corner of Verano and 9th on Friday morning, delivered before dawn by 2 men in an unmarked van who set it up in the dark and left without speaking to anyone. Elira arrived at 6:15 as she always did and found it there. She walked around it once. She ran her hand along the working surface, the smooth grain of the wood. She looked at the depth of the storage below, the quality of the frame joints. She recognized the craftsmanship of someone with access to things she wouldn't ordinarily see. She stood with it for a long moment, her hand resting flat on the surface. Then she went and got her flowers and began the morning. She didn't mention it to anyone. She didn't ask who had sent it. She simply worked from it, and the morning light fell across the new wood the same way it had always fallen across the old, and the lavender went into its buckets, and Mrs. Okafor came by for her Tuesday carnations, and the old man stopped with his dog and leaned in to smell the lavender and didn't buy anything, and Elira charged him nothing for the smell, the same as she always had. Draven, sitting in a meeting 20 blocks away that afternoon, had a brief involuntary thought about whether she'd found it yet. He recognized the thought for what it was and set it aside and returned to the meeting. But later that night, sitting in the chair beside Talira's bed while she slept, he looked at the green scarf on the shelf and understood something quietly about himself that he had not understood before, that he had spent 15 years confusing force with protection, and that the difference between the two was this: one kept things from getting in, and the other went out into the rain without being asked and stayed. He did not know what to do with that understanding yet. He only knew it was true. He brought Talira to Verano and 9th on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the cart had appeared. He told her they were going for a walk, which was not something he said often enough and which made her look at him with the specific bright attention of someone who knows a thing is significant and is deciding not to remark on it in case remarking on it makes it smaller. She took his hand at the door and he let her lead the pace, which was the pace of a 6-year-old noticing everything: a chalk drawing on the pavement, a cat on a window ledge, a man selling newspapers who called her Little Miss and made her stand taller. He said nothing about where they were going. He let the streets lead them there. When they turned onto Verano, Talira's hand tightened in his. He felt it before he understood it. Then she made a sound, Not a word, more like a recognition, and he looked down and saw it happen in her face. The moment the familiar became specific, the moment the corner became the corner, and the woman behind the cart became the person she had been asking about for 2 weeks. She let go of his hand. She ran the way children run when they are running towards something safe, without strategy, without self-consciousness, arms slightly out as if the air itself needed to be navigated, feet finding the ground without looking at it. She covered the distance between them with the complete investment of a person for whom this particular arrival was the most important thing currently happening in the world. Elira looked up from the arrangement she was working on and saw the girl coming. Something moved through her face, a complicated, genuine thing, and she set the flowers down and opened her arms and Elira ran into them. Draven stopped walking. He stood on the pavement 20 feet away and watched his daughter press her face into the shoulder of the woman who had stayed with her in the rain, and he did not move because he understood, in some structural way that went below thought, that this moment was not his. It belonged to them. He was only here to bring it about. Elira was talking, he could see her mouth moving but couldn't hear the words over the ambient noise of the street. Elira was listening with her whole body, the way she had listened to everything, with full attention and no performance. At one point she laughed softly at something the girl said, and the laugh was quiet and real and it reached Draven across the distance the way real things sometimes do. Then Elira said something that made Elira go still. She pulled back slightly and looked at the girl's face and then looked up, over Elira's head, across the 20 feet of pavement, and found Draven's eyes. He didn't look away.